In my last video, I discussed the 4 skills you need to write cinematic music. I'll link that video down in the description if you want to go check that out first. But long story short, the 4 skills were piano, music theory, orchestration, and proficiency within your DAW. That video got super long, and so I didn't want to spend much time going more in depth. So I decided to make a few follow-up videos where I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in talking about how I think about organizing some of those 4 skills. Now, I'm not going to make a separate video about piano practice because I think it's a little more intuitive. I'm not saying you should know if you haven't practiced before, like the best ways to practice and those kind of things. But it's a little more, you can picture in your mind what goes into practicing piano, whereas my whole goal in the prior video in this video series is to try and ease up confusion about what to learn, and not so much the technicalities of what you'll actually be learning. So this video really isn't going to be going into music theory itself. I'm not going to be teaching music theory in this video. I'd like to make those kinds of videos at some point, but I think first, as far as my goals for what I'm going to do on this channel, having a few videos where I talk about the kinds of things you need to learn to get good at this is going to be really meaningful to me, and it's somewhere I'd really like to start in regards to getting regular content up onto my channel, which has been a goal of mine forever. But this topic really matters to me because it's caused me so much stress and anxiety. The 4 skills and everything that falls under it, the content of this entire series of videos is going to be organized on a Google spreadsheet that I made. That's also going to be a link in the description. Please go check that out. It has links to playlists on YouTube that I've made. It has links to books. It has links to websites, all sorts of good stuff. And everything I'm making all these videos is going to be sort of compiled into that one place. So if you don't feel like sitting through videos of listening to me just talk about the things you should be practicing, then just go check that out and get right into it. But without further ado, I'd like to just move into it because I want to keep these 3 follow-up videos where I talk about music theory, orchestration, and proficiency within your DAW much shorter than the first one, because I just want to talk about sort of ways of thinking about it. So there are all sorts of ways of organizing the subdivisions of music theory. It's a hard thing to do, and academics, I imagine, in sort of academic circles of music, that they debate those kinds of things fairly frequently. I'm not sure that there's a solid answer. But if you're someone who's like sort of confused at how any of it all ties together, and you know some basic rhythm, maybe some basic harmony, it still just seems a blur. It seems like this massive void of things that like everyone tells you is connected, but it's kind of hard to picture it. Then I think it's most helpful for that person, that composer, to think of the music theory that you're studying really as pretty much falling under 3 categories. And the first is going to be harmony. So getting good at harmony is crucial in telling a story, particularly without the use of vocals. It's not to say that you can't use vocals in film music. Of course you can, and I think it's even fair to say that trend is picking up, and it's being used more and more and utilized more and more, and not just traditional sort of chorus, choir sounds, but really sort of like lead singers. Hans's score to Dune took massive advantage of the human voice and what it can do, and that was one of my favorite things about that score, was for sort of how otherworldly and different it was than anything we've ever heard before, to use something as human as the human voice to make us believe, to make this universe of human beings who are planets away, thousands and thousands of years from now in the future. It made it felt much more real, and I think that brought a lot of life to that movie. Just as an example. So again, it's not to say that vocals aren't used, but traditional sort of verse chorus vocals being the leading thing of the track, the thing that everyone memorizes, like pop songs, is not really what happens as much traditionally in film music. It's a lot of conveying emotion through, frankly, just your use of harmony, and the melody, of course, goes intertwined with that. But getting good at harmony is something that's just it's sort of it takes a while to really sort of feel like you're making connections, and it's really easy to Google things like what is a seventh chord, for instance, but actually knowing when to use it, when to try and using it is really going to fall into the third category of music theory that I'm going to lay out for you. And I think that's going to be a massive help in picturing all this once we get to the end there. But yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it at that. Harmony is awesome for telling stories. Cool chords, cool chord progressions, cool chord changes, cool key changes, all of these things are really going to make your music stand out in a way that just your use of instruments can't. So yeah, that's going to be the first one, is harmony. Make sure you take the time to study it. And I think maybe when people think of music theory, that might be sort of the first thing they think about. So hopefully there's some idea in your head as to how music theory could help you better tell a story through music or convey your emotion through the music that you're trying to compose. Staying with the same four chords and never using any inversions or variations of those chords or anything, and trying to write a full theme is going to be really difficult. It's not what our ears are used to when it comes to writing film music. So learning harmony, even if you sort of know what it is but have never really taken the time to learn how to implement in your music, is going to be worth your time. And it's not just 7 chords, it's all of that stuff. But if you follow a structured sort of path as to how you're learning the harmony and start with, your major and minor scales and work your way up, it might be sort of boring at first because you're working with chords that are frankly sort of just boring. When you're working with just diatonic triads, there's only so much you can do. But at some point you're going to start to make some real momentum and learn how to implement 7 chords, 9 chords, slash chords, augmented, diminished, all that stuff. Chromatic mediance obviously is one of the biggest ones in film music that every channel out there has a video on, or not. Who knows? I'll probably make a video on them at some point, because learning not just what they are but how to implement them is really, really important, and is really going to help you create music that you want to make. Because a lot of people want to make stuff, at least in the beginning when you're learning, you want to make stuff that sounds like the stuff you hear in movies. And so getting good at all those things, and you'll see when you follow a sort of structured path, when you get past the sort of beginner stuff into the intermediate stuff, it really is a lot less complicated than it may sound or seem. But yeah, that's it for harmony. I'm going to move on to number 2, the second sort of subdivision, if you will, of the theory that I want you to start thinking about it this way, is melody. Think of it as something different from harmony, but of course recognize how just they are totally intertwined, and the melody needs to be conscious of the harmony, and the harmony needs to be conscious of the melody, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But I wanted to take the time to divide them into 2 separate categories, and I want you, the viewer, the aspiring composer, to take some time to learn and study the structure of what goes into good melody writing. And not necessarily just good melody writing, but sort of traditional. What do we hear all the time? What are the patterns that come up all the time in melodies that you like? And that might seem like a path that's discouraging to go down in regards to learning about that stuff, because you might be really anxious about feeling like all of a sudden the freedom you have in trying to write your own melody is gone, because you got to follow all these patterns. And I don't think that's my reaction. I think more often than not, you'll hear one thing or 2 things or 3 things when it comes to analyzing the structure of melody that you're going to be like, oh yeah, that's the kind of thing I've been wanting to implement in my melodies. It's not necessarily that you have to copy a whole structure, but you can learn bits and pieces to really implement in your own writing. And then once you learn the basics of how other people go about writing melodies, that's when you really are, in my opinion anyways, free to go out and genuinely explore into doing new things and trying to come up with new things. I think that it really takes a real understanding of what goes into a lot of the biggest and most famous and infamous melodies that we all know, whether it be film music or any genre of music, what goes into those, and then how can we learn from that and improve upon them. So, the 2 sort of 3 things, if I were to label them to really just nail down, would be sentence form, period form, and counterpoint. I sort of think of them in my head as all three being terms which fall under melody. They're not strictly melodically based. I mean, sentence and period form are really fundamentally about writing melody, but of course they go hand in hand with harmony, how you use them and implement them. And learning about things like sentence form will really change the way you view momentum and movement in your music. It'll give you a better understanding of when to try and use some fancy chords. And so, yeah, that was for me one thing that was like, I had this idea in my head of chords I liked, but I never knew when to really try them in my chord progressions in my writing. And learning about things like sentence and period form and counterpoint can give you a much better sort of visualization and conceptualization of what goes into trying unique different chords that, other than maybe just sort of, your diatonic 1, 4, and 5, and 6, branching out and those kind of things. Learning the structure of the melody will really help you get to where you want to go, and implementing the cooler and more sort of emotional chords, I guess is how I would put it. And all of that leads us to number 3, which is going to be structure. And this is perhaps the most vague of the of the categories that I've sort of come up with in my mind as far as ways of thinking about music theory. But I think when you really start to analyze structure, and studying structure of theory means learning about things like studying other scores, really studying other scores, not just looking at them and listening to them, but paying attention to their orchestrations, their implementation of recurring themes and motifs and sentence and period form within the piece and how they orchestrate it and all this. On the one hand, it sort of sounds like it's almost just everything, but on the other, I think it's much more just about paying attention to why, not that it always comes down to 8-bar sections, but like what were the decisions that went into organizing this 8-bar structure the way it is, then the next 8-bar structure, and so on and so forth. And you'll realize that there are lots of patterns. And you'll also, on the flip side of things, realize that a lot of really big themes and orchestrations that might seem like really daunting because it's like every 8 bars there's a new melody or something, is sort of what it feels like. It might not, in fact, it usually isn't that, and it's much more about strategizing, having an A and a B theme and orchestrating it in an interesting way, and how, really focusing on the structure is going to allow you to see how longer pieces of music and more interesting pieces of music and pieces of music which genuinely are building throughout the entire piece in some way. Focusing on these things is going to go just an absolutely monumental way in improving your compositions. So there's a playlist that I made on the spreadsheet for all 3 of these subcategories, covering videos including videos, that cover these topics. And so if that is of any interest to you, just go check them out on the Google Sheet below. I made that accessible to everyone. And I've also linked there a few basic sort of starting places, a YouTube channel, a website, some reading about just a very structured, maybe a little less in depth, but very structured sort of course path to follow with sort of all things music theory. And if you haven't done any music theory before, I would advise starting there, because I think the first and most important thing to understand is not necessarily the technicalities of defining certain types of chords or certain forms or any of that stuff. It's more understanding how the different components of theory and music making are connected with each other. And when you do that, then you can really start implementing all of these cool different techniques that music theory gives us, and options that music theory makes available for us. So I hope you found that helpful. Again, please do check out that Google spreadsheet. And until next time, I will be talking about orchestration, which is going to be a fun one. And I'm going to try my best in that video, I think, to mostly just sort of try and verbalize how orchestration, how thinking about it as something different from harmonic, melodic music theory is going to be useful to you in your writing. So take care, best of luck with your creative work moving forward, and I'll see you next week. So long.